Hello again, and in this lecture we'll be looking at Mussolini's seizure of power in October 1922. And so here the first key question should be, well, who was Benito Mussolini? And so let me tell you a little bit about his biography. He was born in Romagna, in a region south of Bologna in central Italy. And it's important to know this because the Romagna was kind of much influenced by the anarchist and socialist movement. And indeed, his father, who was a blacksmith, was a radical militant socialist. This is the kind of milieu in which the young Mussolini grew up, but he was a very restless, self-taught intellectual. He actually moved to Switzerland at some stage to avoid the compulsory military service, continued to study there, then returned to Italy in 1904. And then his kind of his persona as a journalist, as a polemicist, as a socialist militant began to grow to the point that by 1911 he had become the chief editor of Avanti, which was a daily paper of the Socialist Party. Hence, at that point, he was, if you like, a young, promising revolutionary socialist. Now, what happens is that then World War I comes in 1914, and as we mentioned in the previous lecture, within the Socialist Party, the internationalist position was the prevailing one. Hence, the idea that Italy should stay out of the war because this was a capitalist's war. And Mussolini, as chief editor of Avanti, very much kept to that line initially. And then by October 1914, during the big debate whether or not Italy should intervene, he literally changed sides and produced an editorial in which he said that actually the time had come for Italy to show his hand, to side with the Triple Entente, with France, Britain and Russia, and enter the war and make history. And to some extent it was a gamble. He probably thought at the time that he could bring the Socialist Party with him, but the initiative backfired. He was actually expelled from the party, and he found himself isolated. And so, in a way, he became one of the many political leaders and journalists who were, in a way, fighting for Italy to enter the war. He created his own daily paper called Il Popolo d'Italia, the Italian people, and became, as a journalist, one of the strongest voices in favor of Italy's intervention. And when the war came for Italy in 1915, he stopped being a journalist, volunteered in the war where he was wounded. So in a way, he came back from the war with the charisma of being a war veteran, and then continued his kind of political battle as, in a way, a representative of the nationalist movement. And at that time there were many different groups, in a way, jockeying for a position of privilege within the political debate. But Mussolini was the best one in trying to somehow group behind him a lot of restless groups of ex-soldiers, many of them violent, who were trying to kind of fight against the threat of a socialist revolution, and therefore trying to break the strikes, the occupation of lands which the socialists were bringing forward, particularly in those 2 years called the Biennio Rosso, the red years of 1919 to 1921, during which it looked as if Italy could actually become the part of a socialist revolution. And at that point, what happened is that Mussolini became, as we said in the previous lecture, the man of providence. He was a very good orator, a very good journalist and polemicist, and proved to be a very good political leader as well. Convinced larger and larger circles amongst the industrialists, amongst the army, the police forces, the judiciary, that after all he was the best man, the right man to bring back order, law and order in Italy. By that time he had created the fascist movement, which was renowned for its violence and the violence used by the Black Squads in order to fight against the socialist strikes and occupations of lands and factories. But Mussolini always managed to present that kind of violence as somehow justified, almost as an act of self-defense. And then what happened was that this crisis of liberal politics in a way created the right situation for him to eventually push towards taking seizure of power. But, by the way, the fascist propaganda for 20 years presented the fascist revolution as if it was some sort of march to seize power in Rome violently. In reality, the March on Rome did take place, but I wouldn't exactly call it a revolution. And why? Well, because in a way, what Mussolini understood in October 1922 is that the crisis had come to a point that despite the fact that the Fascist Party by then did not have the majority in parliament, hence he did not have a right to present himself as the next prime minister, he thought that there was, in a way, weakness enough and support for him enough within the kind of the power basis of Italian society to be able to push, in a way, to raise the stakes and try to seize power. So what he did in October 1922, he asked for the fascist squads all over Italy to converge on Rome. He didn't go to Rome, by the way, stayed safely in Milan just in case things went wrong. And things could have gone wrong because in a way, at that time, the fascist squads were far from being militarily capable of seizing power. All the king had to do was declare a state of emergency, use the army to stop the fascists, and fascism would have probably been defeated there and then, and perhaps once and for all. But the then king, King Victor Emmanuel III, as we know, was not famous for his strength of character. He always preferred to take the easier decision, and he knew that after all, within the royal family, within conservative circles, within the army in particular, there was stronger and stronger support for fascism. So he was also warned that if we asked the army to turn against the fascists, there was a chance that some army units would actually refuse to obey orders and actually side with the fascists. So at that point, it took the easy solution, together with some liberal leaders, that the best thing was to give Mussolini the prime ministership of a coalition government. By the way, it wasn't a fascist government. The first Mussolini government of October 1923 was a coalition government with liberal, Catholic and Republican ministers. And so that's how Mussolini began and eventually find himself in the seat of power. But what is important is the way in which from October 1923 onwards, he slowly and little by little managed to move the Italian constitutional monarchy towards a dictatorship. And how did he do that? Well, first of all, using this sense of crisis as a reason in order to impose stricter and stricter rules on the freedom of the press, on the freedom of political parties to oppose him. And then in a way, the crunch came in 1924, in the summer of 1924, because what happened then is that we had general elections in the early months. The Fascist Party, also thanks to a reform of the electoral system by Mussolini, which favored the fascists eventually found themselves in majority in parliament. But one of the leaders of the Socialist Party, Giacomo Matteotti, was very outspoken in attacking Mussolini and in a way exposing not just the fraud that had been taking place, but also the violence through which the fascists had ensured that, for example, in some seats, socialist voters would not be allowed to vote. Hence, Matteotti was a strong voice of criticism against fascism. And what happened is that in that summer of 1924, he disappeared all of a sudden. He was kidnapped, then his body was found, and it was clear that he had been beaten to death. And it became fairly clear in the early days, in the early investigation after the murder, that it was the act of a fascist squad. The fascists had killed him. So the big question was, to what extent was the death of Matteotti linked to Mussolini himself? To what extent was he responsible for it? So that was a clear moment of crisis for fascism. And once again, the king could have made all the difference, because he could have asked for Mussolini's resignation. And at that very point in the autumn of 1924, Mussolini would have probably resigned. But then he understood that there was not enough will within, if you like, whatever was left on non-fascist circles in Italy, whether it was the opposition parties or within the royal family and the army, there wasn't enough, if you like, will to depose Mussolini, and he decided to, in a way, turn things round. And in a famous speech to the parliament on the 3rd of January of 1925, he simply said, well, I am the leader of fascism. If you think that Matteotti was murdered by fascists, I, as the leader of fascism, am responsible for it, and I will accept the responsibility, but what I will do is I will make sure through my control of Italian society that this will never happen again. And that's what he did. And in a way, the gamble worked, because, once again, within the judiciary, within the opposition, there wasn't enough capacity to bring him to resignation. And indeed, he then moved in the opposite direction and promulgated a number of laws, the so-called leggi fascistissime, the super-fascist laws, which one by one took to pieces the freedom of the press, the freedom to oppose the party in power. Hence, it is in 1925 that we have the creation of a dictatorship, and it's only then that we can say that Mussolini was the duce, the dictator, the commander of Italy.